welcome to this week's episode of Composer Tea. My name is Miss Sperotto, and this is Kitty, who doesn't do anything and is an escape artist. I also just woke him up from a nap, so he's like, I'm comfortable. For this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Maurice Ravel, who I really like. Maurice Ravel was a French composer. He was a pianist, and he was also a conductor. He had a very distinct style, and I would say that his most famous work is Bolero, which we're going to be talking about, but there's also some other ones that are really well known that he did. Daphnis and Chloe, which is a ballet. Pavane for a Dead Princess, which sounds like super morbid, but it's actually a really pretty piece. And then also, it's not his most famous by any means, but is my personal favorite, Tzigane. That piece speaks to my soul. It makes me feel like maybe I was a gypsy in a past life. So anyways, let's get into this. Let's talk about this dude's childhood. Maurice Ravel was born in 1875, and he was born in France, but he was born on the French and Spanish border. So he was very close to Spain. His dad was a successful engineer, and he was also an inventor. And his mom, she was Basque and Spanish. Ooh. Okay. He was done. It's only 10 seconds into this video, kitty. Gosh. Basque is kind of like a ethnic group in Europe, and it's a lot of times the people of that ethnic group are right on that French-Spanish border, so she was Basque. However, in comparison to his dad, who was very educated, she was barely literate. And by those standards of the day, in the 19th century, people kind of thought that the dad kind of married beneath him, oh my gosh, you can do so much better than that. But in the end, it didn't really matter because he was happy. They were a really happy couple. So he had very happy, very loving parents. Some of his dad's inventions were really successful, and they did really well. For an example, one of those things was one of the first internal combustion engines. Cool, I guess. What that does. But then there were some other inventions that were not so successful. Kind of like the roller coaster he invented called the Whirlwind of Death. And it had quite a few actual deaths associated with it. I shouldn't laugh. That's not nice. But oh my gosh, it's called the Whirlwind of Death and people actually legit died on it? Hello? Not cool. So when that was invented, Maurice Ravel was about 3 months old or so, and because that invention didn't go so well in the area they were living in, they decided, you know what, let's move to Paris as a family and let's start over. So growing up in Paris, Ravel was very influenced by his mom and his mom's heritage as well. He was kind of a mama's boy. And he once wrote that one of his earliest memories was of his mom singing to him all the different folk songs that she learned when she was little. So sweet. Growing up, he also had a younger brother, and the family wasn't rich, but they were comfortable. And he had a really nice childhood, which I think is wonderful, because there have been composers I've talked about to you, and they've had a terrible childhood. So I'm so glad that he had a really nice one. He also had a family that really loved music. They were a musical family, not musical in the way they all played an instrument or whatever, but they just loved music. There's actually no records of Ravel going to school when he was younger. Historians actually think that his dad just taught him everything, homeschooled him for a very long time. We do know that when he was 7 years old, he started taking piano lessons. And then when he was 12 years old, he started taking composition lessons. And at the age of 14, it was his first public performance, his first concert that he had. And Ravel wasn't a child prodigy by any means. He wasn't like a Mozart, but he was definitely a very musically sensitive kid. Like, he was one of those kids and like music was just his thing. So in that same year as that public performance that he had when he was 14, his family encouraged him to go to the conservatory in Paris. So he enrolled and he got accepted. And while he was there, he didn't really stand out as a student. Like, he didn't like shine and like, oh, Ravel is amazing. That just wasn't the reaction that his teachers had about him. They were just like, oh yeah, and then there's Ravel. When he was there at the conservatory and in any music school, you have to kind of learn about different forms and there's different exercises you have to do. And they just didn't really interest him. So if he's sitting there in a lesson and they're talking about fugues and canons, he was just like, okay, I'm learning it, but he just didn't care. However, this actually was a very significant time for him as a budding composer. So he grows up and he's there for a while, and now he's an adult. He's like 18, 19, 20, something like that. He's at the start of his career, and as he matured, he kind of became the type of person that became very indifferent to praise or criticism. So you could be like, oh my gosh, Ravel, that's like so nice. And then he would be like, thanks. Or it could be a different situation where it's like, Ravel, I don't understand why you did this key signature situation here. That doesn't even make any sense. And he would be like, okay. So to a lot of people, it kind of seemed like he was just this indifferent person, like he's just there. He kind of seemed to have that attitude if you didn't know him very well. But he was actually not like that at all. He was actually very self-critical, and he was definitely a perfectionist. I mean, I think I'm a perfectionist, and I think he was more of a perfectionist than I am. That's like a lot of perfection. And really what it was is that he wasn't being indifferent. He just didn't really, I don't want to say he didn't care about other people's opinions, but that's not the opinion that mattered to him. The opinion that mattered to him was his own, because if it wasn't right to him, then it doesn't really matter what other people think. In the end, it was his composition, and it mattered what he thought. Another thing that's funny to note is as he got older, and this is kind of something that carried on for the rest of his life, is he was very well known for having the best appearance. Like, he would dress in the latest fashions, he would always look nice, like always look nice. And that was just a thing for him, like he had to look good. I can appreciate that. But another thing about Ravel was he was a very tiny man. Like, I read two different heights. I've read either 5'2" or 5'3". Either way, it's like not that big of a difference. So like, if you had me standing next to Ravel, I would look like a giant next to him. I'm 5'7", so I would look like Jolly Green. So maybe that was why he cared so much about his appearance. Maybe he was compensating for that. I'm not sure. But he was a very tiny man. We do know that. So he's grown up now, and he is a legit composer, and he has composed a few things along the way. But in the very beginning of his career, he is met by a scandal. I kind of like this. This is a green tea with berry and acai. I always feel so awkward when I have to say that. How do you pronounce the C in that? I don't know. It's actually really good though. Anyways, it's a scandal. Let's talk. It's at the beginning of his career, and everybody in France at that time knew that if you're going to seal the deal on being an amazing composer, you should probably enter the Prix de Rome. Now, I'm not going to go into the Prix de Rome and like all of that in this video. If you want to find out more about the Prix de Rome, you should go listen to my video on Hector Berlioz, and I talk a little bit more of the history of that. I'll link it somewhere or below. I don't know. I'll figure it out. So Ravel in his life had made 5 different attempts to win the Prix de Rome. Let's talk about each one. It won't take long. The first time he submitted to the Prix de Rome, he was eliminated after the first round. Denied! Side note, this has nothing to do with the Prix de Rome, but this was also around the same time that he wrote Pavane for a Dead Princess. It's a beautiful French horn solo. Also, a pavane is a kind of a dance, just so you know. Anyways, the second time he tried to win the Prix de Rome, he actually came in on 2nd place, which is great, but you don't get to go to Rome if you're 2nd place, not 1st place. The third time he submitted a piece, he got nothing. Denied! As well as the 4th time he submitted something, he got nothing. Denied! And the judges who were judging the compositions and the different things that came in for the Prix de Rome, they said that they didn't think he was trying very hard at this point, which was kind of like a slap in the face. Like, why would you enter this competition if you weren't trying hard? And why would you enter 5 different times? It's not nice. So next comes the 5th time, and also the last time he submits a piece for the Prix de Rome. And at this point in his career, he's 30 years old, and he's composed other stuff. Like, the Prix de Rome is not the only thing he's been doing this entire time. And the public actually really likes his stuff. Like, he's actually gaining a lot of popularity in France. The French love Ravel right now. And not only do the French people like Ravel, the French press also really likes Ravel, which is very important. So he once more submits another piece to the judges for the Prix de Rome, and after the first round, he's denied. Denied! And the French people and the French press, they flip out. The public and the press are outraged. They're like, how dare you? How dare you? And the French press, they were blaming the conservatory, who like basically hosts all this stuff or whatever. They're like, you're just being too stuffy. Okay, I don't know what your beef is with Ravel here, but obviously like 5 times and nothing's gone. Like, we know he's a good composer. What's your deal? Well, there was a deal. Come to find out, one of the judges was a professor at the conservatory, and only his students were making the final round for the Prix de Rome. Caught you red-handed. So once the public find out about that, which they always do, it became a national scandal. So the French were so upset about this that Ravel didn't even place in this Prix de Rome competition, that the entire country was like, no. So the judge, professor at the conservatory, he was forced to resign or retire, however you want to look at that. And then they had to completely restructure the way they do things for the Prix de Rome, such as, who are the judges going to be? How do we pick these applicants? How are we making sure this is going to be fair? So that was actually like a huge deal back then. I really like this. This is yummy. Now, luckily for Ravel, even though he didn't win the Prix de Rome, everybody loved him after that. They were like, oh my gosh, Ravel. Love him. You know what? He loved it too. He just ate that attention up. So for the next 10 years or so, he wrote a lot of works for piano, and then he would switch them into an orchestra piece. And he did that quite a bit. And so you can actually find a lot of his works where there's 2 different versions of it. There's like a piano version, and then there's an orchestral version. And the other thing during this time And this kind of happened throughout his life. He was not the kind of composer that would just pump out a bunch of music all the time. Like if you think of the video of Vivaldi where it was like, what did I say? I don't even know, like 500 pieces or something like that. He was not Vivaldi. But that's okay. He worked slowly, but I have an idea, and this is a personal opinion, maybe because he was so self-critical and he was a perfectionist, maybe that's why it just took him a little bit longer, so that when that piece finally came out and it was ready, it was good. And it was up to Ravel's standards. And I think maybe that's why the public liked it so much. Instead of just pumping out a bunch of different things, like throwing spaghetti on the wall, what he did come out with was fantastic. He also wasn't the kind of person that cared about financial matters all the time. He wasn't like someone who was spending money like crazy or anything like that, but it just wasn't something that I think he was super worried about, like a lot of other composers and musicians. And also, you think if he was really worried about it, he probably would have composed more in that time so that there was more revenue coming in. But I think he was more worried about the quality of the work. And it shows, because it is wonderful music. He also wasn't really into teaching. A lot of times composers, to earn extra money, they would teach private lessons on the side, or they would work at a university, or something else just to get some extra income coming in. And he didn't really do that. He did teach a few students who he thought would truly actually benefit from him teaching them. But because he was such a self-critical and a perfectionist himself, he was a very demanding teacher. So teaching just wasn't his jam. It's my jam. Raspberry jam. Honestly, that's like the best of all the jams, so whatever. Another little fun fact is that we also know that during this entire time, so what is he? This is between the age of 30 and 40. He lived with his mom, like, since he was a kid. He never moved out of his mom's house. I don't know. My mom tells me she loves me a lot. Mom, if you're watching, I love you. But I'm 35, so this is about the age that Ravel would be living with his mom, and I don't think she would want me living with her. I'm just being honest. No, it's time to grow up. But he never did. And then the other thing during this time is we still don't know very much about his private life. We know for sure that he never married. But the rest of it is kind of a mystery, and it's all hearsay. I've read different accounts that possibly that he may have been really nervous and self-conscious around women, and they think that maybe it was because of his height. But then there was also some rumors about some other women that he was in love with and he wanted to get married to. And while there is evidence that he and those particular women were definitely friends and they had a friendship, that doesn't necessarily mean that you love them and you want to get married to them. It's okay to have a friendship. So really that's just some old tea, and we have no evidence to back it up. But as far as we do know, we don't think he had any significant long-term relationships in his life. So those 10 years go by, and that's about what's happening during that time. He composes a lot of different things, and he's about 40 now. And during this time, World War I starts to break out. And Germany starts to invade France. And Ravel, unlike a lot of composers in France, he enlists in the armed forces in France, and he tried to get a position in being in one of the most dangerous branches, and he wanted to be part of the Air Corps. So he thought he would be ideal to fly a plane, and a lot of time pilots aren't really tall. You actually want to be a shorter stature if you're going to be a pilot. I don't know why, I just know things. So he was actually an ideal height. However, he was rejected because of his age, and because apparently he had like a very mild heart condition. Literally, that is the only time I ever heard about a heart condition or a complaint. So I have no idea like what was going on with that. I really don't know. So instead, the military gave him a different job, and they're like, okay, Ravel, we need you to drive a truck. Now, I'm not really sure exactly what his job was, because I've heard two different things. One, that he was just a truck driver for supplies, but he had to bring supplies into the front lines. But I've also read that he was an ambulance driver, which I guess is also kind of like a big truck. Maybe he did both. But even though he wasn't fighting on the front lines of the war, it was still a very dangerous job because he had to like still get in there with his truck. So he was still in it, even though he wasn't actually fighting. During this time, as happens in wars, he lost several friends and he watched them die, and this was very upsetting to him. I can't even imagine. Also during this time, his mom had also passed away, and he was so upset by that. One thing he was doing during this time, though, that I'm sure probably was some sort of escape, he did compose this entire time. So he was still putting work out there. It wasn't as much, but he was still putting stuff out there. So by the end of the war, he'd actually become quite famous. And he was actually pretty famous with other composers in France because he actually went to fight in the war and he was still composing during it. So I think he got not only fame, but respect because of that. So because he had become really famous at this point, he was awarded the Legion of Honor. The Legion of Honor is one of the highest ranking awards that someone can receive in France. It was started in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte. That dude. He was also really short. This is an award that's still given out today, and a lot of times it's given out for like military things or civil things, and sometimes they give it out for the arts. However, he refused to accept this award. He felt the people who got this award kind of schmoozed their way into it to get it, and he didn't want to be associated with any of that. Well then, heaven forbid someone wants to do something nice. So after all of this World War I stuff was wrapped up and it's over, the people who were really close to Ravel had noticed that he had lost a lot of his physical and mental stamina. And even though before the war he wasn't composing a whole lot in comparison to maybe some of the other composers in France, but after the war he was composing even less. And by less I mean like only like one composition a year. Now there's nothing wrong with that, it was just unusual and people noticed. However, historians typically agree that the music that was written after the war was some of the best music that he wrote. One of those pieces was my favorite, Tzigane. It's so good. You guys need to listen to the whole thing. I have it linked below. During this time, another thing that happened, because he was living with his mother previous to all this, he was like, you know what, I need to move. I'm gonna move out of this house and go into another house. So he actually moved to a little house in the countryside. And he lived in that house for the rest of his life. Now this was a quirky, eclectic little house. And actually they made this house into a museum and you can still go visit it today. So because Ravel was a tiny little dude, he actually made his house tiny as well. So his house kind of looked like a little dollhouse in a way. So it had tiny little door openings and the ceilings were like really abnormally low. He also was really into gardening. So he made his own Japanese style garden in the backyard, which I would love to see. And then inside his house, the way he would decorate it was kind of interesting. So a lot of times he would go to flea markets in Paris, or maybe if he was traveling somewhere, he would find things. One of the things he would do is he would find paintings he would like, and then he would put them up in his house and he would invite people over And he'd be like,
"Oh, do you see that painting over there? That's a famous Renoir."
And then the people who were visiting his house would be like,
"Really? Nuh-uh. Oh my gosh, that's like amazing."
And then he would be like,
"Dude, I'm totally lying to you. Like, know your art."
He thought it was like totally hilarious to lie to these people. And then the other thing that was actually pretty weird was he would buy these mechanical little toys and he would have them around his house, but he also felt like these little mechanical toys had a musical soul. I don't know, like that. He lived in a dollhouse. I have no idea. That was his thing. So it was a little quirky in that way. However, he was starting to tour, so he actually wasn't there all the time because he was traveling to all these different countries and putting on concerts. So he wasn't there, so maybe when he did come home, he wanted a place where he felt cozy. Where is the cat? Like, it's been a while. He was doing so well last week. One of the places that he toured was the United States. And he went to, I think it was 23 different cities in the United States. And he went like all over. He was very well received. People loved him and he made a lot of money. And he also kind of soaked up some of the American culture and he listened to a lot of jazz. He hung out with George Gershwin. They were friends. So when he returned back to France after this big tour that he took around the United States, he composed his most famous work that he's known for today, Bolero. So Bolero was written in 1928, and even though it was popular back then, and it is still very popular today, it's kind of considered to be a little bit of an unusual piece, the way it was composed. It's one movement long, and it's 15 minutes. And there's only one melodic line the whole time. And the only variation that you have is the orchestra and the different instruments that join in with either the melody or the rhythm. But really, it's a song with the same thing repeated over and over and over again. That melody is repeated 9 different times in this song. You've probably heard it before. So really you can just hear there's either a melody or a rhythm. That's basically the whole song. And there's definitely some jazz influences in there. That's probably from his trip through the United States. Bolero is actually a slow, kind of a Latin song, but it's also a type of a ballroom dance. And this piece was originally commissioned to be a ballet. And at this time, Ravel had worked on a bunch of different ballets. For an example, there was Daphnis and Chloe, which is gorgeous. That'll be linked below for you. He'd also worked with different types of dances, and this wasn't really a new concept for him. So he composes it, there's choreography that is set to it, and the choreographers wrote this in the program for the audience. Inside a tavern in Spain, people dance beneath the brass lamp hung from the ceiling. In response to the cheers to join in, the female dancer has leapt onto the long table and her steps become more and more animated. That's actually the only thing they wrote for the audience. This is not program music, you would think it is. There was actually dancing in the original thing, so this was meant as a dance. If you listen to this recording, you can actually kind of envision that happening. I can't find a video right now of the original choreography, but you can kind of see that happening as the piece goes along. And for as simple as this piece sounds, the audience loved it. It was an instant success. And Ravel was actually kind of surprised. He kind of thought that most orchestras wouldn't want to perform this because it is, I think he knew it. It was the same thing over and over again. But they did. They still do. Funny enough, because of copyright law, even though Ravel has obviously passed, he's still making money off of this song years and years and years later, even after his death. So each year, this piece makes $2.2 million. And all of that money goes to the Ravel estate. I don't really know what that means. Like, does someone actually benefit from that money, or does it just go to his house? I'm not really sure, but that's a lot of money. That means that piece is still that popular, and it is still played that much today. So moving on, after the success of Bolero, Ravel started getting like these really weird memory lapses. Like, there was one day he went to the beach and he forgot how to swim. And this isn't in a joking way. Like, he actually was like, oh, why can't I do this? He would also start forgetting the names of people he would see literally every single day. And then there's other weird things, like he would forget the names of objects. So like, for an example, this is a cup. He would have a conversation and say something like, oh, what is this thing called? It also got to a point where he was physically not able to like speak and like say the words, almost like a coordination thing. So it was getting pretty bad. The other thing was, in 1932, he was in a really bad car accident, and he kind of had a bit of a head injury. And a lot of his friends and his family traced it back to that point when all of this was actually happening. Like, oh, it's because of that accident. But there's actually evidence before that car accident that this was actually a thing. It was happening much longer before that. So at the time, he was examined by a bunch of neurologists, and they couldn't quite pinpoint at the time what exactly was wrong with him. So there were a bunch of things out there like, oh, maybe he has dementia, or maybe he has Alzheimer's, or maybe he has a brain tumor. They didn't really know, and they didn't have the technology back then to really hone in on exactly what was wrong with him. So later on, scientists and doctors actually realized what he had was called frontotemporal dementia. It's hard for me to say, I'm sorry. I'm going to refer to it from now on as Pick's disease, because that's the other thing that it's commonly called. So basically, it's a type of dementia where not only does it affect the language part of the brain, but there's certain parts of the brain, like the language part of the brain, that kind of starts to waste away. But there's other parts of the brain that actually start to grow and develop. So it's actually pretty strange. Also, another characteristics of Pick's disease is that people who typically have that, because that part of the brain is growing, there are bursts of creativity. But they find that the creativity that these people usually exhibit is a repetitive type of creativity. So it might be a brilliant idea, but it's typically exhibited over and over and over again. So neurologists today, they actually think that Bolero was actually composed during this creative burst, because if you think of the nature of Bolero, it is the same thing, 9 different times, over and over and over again. So in 1937, it was starting to get very bad. And it was one of those kinds of things where he knew what was going on. It wasn't like, oh, he has no idea what's going on. Like, he was very aware of his surroundings and what was happening to him, but he wasn't able to communicate. He was forgetting people's names, but he also knew there was something very wrong with him. So he had a doctor that proposed a surgery that would reinflate the part of the brain that was starting to kind of waste away. I have no idea how you would do that. Is that even a thing? So Ravel had the surgery. He woke up from the surgery. He called out to his brother. And then right after that, he slipped into a coma. He was in a coma for 9 days. And then he passed away. I think it's absolutely terrible. I kind of feel like he died too soon. Even if this had never happened to him, like, and he had only composed 1 piece a year, what else would he have composed? So how do we remember Ravel today? He was a very good orchestrator. He also had a very distinct style. And he was probably one of the formative composers for modern music. I think he kind of helped start that. And I don't know if he realized that he kind of helped start that, but I think he was like one of those composers during that time. And his stuff was just good. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Composer Tea, where we spilled the tea on the life of Maurice Ravel. I don't know where Kitty is. I'm pretty sure he's sleeping on my bed right now. When he sleeps, he's like in a perfect circle. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with his roundness. It's adorable. All right, you guys have a nice week. I'll see you next week. Bye.